Hi everybody, this is the video for Module 8, which deals with the meanings of fractions, decimals, and percents. Um, Before we get started in the examples, I guess I just want to remind you about what the meaning of these three terms basically involves. And although they all seem a little bit different in terms of their representation and what they look like, fractions, decimals, and percents all represent part of a whole. Okay, so whatever that amount is, so if you have one whole amount, a fraction just tells you what part of that you actually have. A decimal tells you what part of that you actually have. A percent tells you what part of that whole you actually have. Okay, so all three of these representations are all dealing with the same thing. It's just that they're different ways of illustrating that part. All right, so the examples that we look at will just kind of show you in kind of picture form what each one of these represents. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we will go ahead and get started with the examples. All right, so let's jump into the examples. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is we're going to look at a fraction. And what we want to do is we want to basically try and visualize what the fraction, in this case 3/5, actually represents. And again, always think back to our kind of overarching definition where a fraction in this case represents part of a whole amount. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at the denominator, and the denominator is 5. And what that means is that our whole amount is divided into 5 equal pieces. Okay. So in this illustration, we've got 5 different parts all together. Okay. The numerator tells us how many of those parts we actually have. Okay, so from this one whole amount, what we're going to deal with then is we've got 1, 2, 3 pieces. Okay, that's the part. Okay, so we have 3 out of 5 pieces. The whole amount is represented by that whole big rectangle, and we have 3 of those equal sized pieces. So 3/5, 3 parts out of 5 total parts that make up the whole. Okay, does that make sense? I hope so. So with that, let's then talk about what a decimal looks like. Okay, or how to translate the idea of a decimal. So again, we're going to draw a sketch here to illustrate what the decimal, in this case 0.6 or 6/10 represents. And easiest way to think about it is start by saying the number 6/10. What that means is we are going to take the whole amount and we're going to split it up into 10 pieces because we're in the tenths column. What's unique about decimals is decimal numbers are based on powers of 10. So when we split the whole amount into parts, it's either going to be into 10 pieces or 100 pieces or 1,000 pieces or 10,000 pieces, so on and so forth. Okay. So with 0.6 or 6/10, we're going to split it up into 10 pieces. So there's 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth until we get up to 10 parts. So this represents the one whole amount. Okay. And what we need is we need 6 of those. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay. That represents the part. Okay, so 6/10, 6 out of 10 pieces. Again, we're always going back to that definition of a decimal or fraction or percent represents part of the whole amount. Okay. All right, final example is a percent. Okay, so now we're going to look at 60%. And what makes percents unique is that whenever you see the percent symbol, what that means is we are automatically dividing the whole amount into 100 pieces. Percent means out of 100. Okay. So unlike fractions where you can cut it into as many pieces as you want, and unlike decimal numbers where you cut it into either tens or hundreds or thousands, percent automatically means cut it into 100 pieces. Okay, so if we start doing that, we're just going to have a bunch of tiny pieces in this case. So there we go. We'll let it show you the 100 pieces all together. And what we need then is 60 of those. So the one whole is represented by those 100 little tiny little slivers there. And then there is our 60 pieces. So the part that we have is 60 out of 100. Okay, so 60% is simply dividing the whole amount into 100 pieces, and then the number that we have tells us how many of those 100 pieces make up the part that we are looking at. Okay? And there you go. Those are our representations for fractions, decimals, and percents. Now, as we talk about fractions, decimals, and percents, again, the key thing to remember is that they all mean essentially the same thing. They're talking about the part that you have out of the whole amount. Okay? They're just different ways of representing them, and different situations call for the different representation. Sometimes fractions are better to use, sometimes a decimal is easier to use, sometimes a percent is easier to use. So it just kind of depends on the situation, which representation that we use. And what you're going to find is you can switch between the representations. We can change fractions into decimals and decimals into percents and percents back into fractions and so on and so forth. And that's what we're going to do in our next video. We're going to talk about the procedures for converting between the different representations. So for this video, hopefully the explanation helps clarify a little bit about what these things represent. If you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. I'm always happy to help out with those. Otherwise, thanks for watching this video, and we will see you in the next video.